July 12, 1944. A forested hillside near Struthof, Alsace, France. The air was usually clean here, smelling of pine needles and damp earth. But Private Ben Carter, a rifleman with the 90th Infantry Division, suddenly caught a scent that made him gag, a sickly, acrid stench that cut through the pleasant mountain air like a rusty knife. It wasn't the smell of burnt powder or decaying enemy flesh, smells he had become grimly accustomed to since the landings at Utah Beach. This was chemical. It was wrought, but intensified, metallic, inhuman. Carter and his squad, part of a reconnaissance patrol, were pushing through the dense woods toward what intelligence maps marked as a minor German military outpost, possibly an SS communications center. They were weeks ahead of the main Allied line, maneuvering through the Vosges Mountains to eliminate pockets of resistance following the swift American advance. They had fought the Wehrmacht, tough, professional, ruthless soldiers, but the fighting had, until now, felt like war. "Hold up, Carter! What the hell is that?" Sergeant Frank Kowalski whispered, his M1 Garand held ready. He had caught the scent too, his face suddenly paled beneath the trail dust. They moved cautiously, pushing aside wet branches until the woods abruptly gave way to a cleared hillside. Below them, carved into the stone slope, was a grim, isolated complex. It wasn't a military barracks. It was surrounded by a high, thick perimeter of barbed wire, twisted in cruel, deliberate coils. The watchtowers were manned not by weary Wehrmacht infantry, but by stiff, black-uniformed SS Totenkopfverbände, Death's Head units. The silence was the most terrifying thing. No artillery fire, no machine guns, only the faint, terrible smell, now stronger, and the low, mechanized hum of something incomprehensible. Carter raised his binoculars. He expected to see training yards or perhaps a prison for Allied officers. What he saw defied comprehension. Figures shuffled behind the wire. They were men, yet skeletal, wearing striped pajamas that hung loose on their bone-thin frames. Their heads were shorn. Their eyes were huge, vacant pools in their sunken faces, staring at nothing. Kowalski lowered his voice to a hoarse whisper. "Jesus Christ, that's not a prison! What is that?" As they watched, a small group of SS guards emerged from a stone building. They were dragging two bodies, impossibly light, like bundles of sticks. They tossed them onto a small motorized cart without ceremony. The cart drove toward a separate, smaller building at the far end of the compound, a squat, smokestack-capped structure. And from that chimney, a thin, greasy black smoke began to curl into the summer sky. The horror wasn't immediate. It was a slow, sickening realization, piece by piece. The smell, the wire, the uniforms, the bodies. This was not a military objective. This was an engine of systematic extermination. They had stumbled upon the first partial liberation by Western forces, a satellite labor camp of Natzweiler-Struthof. Carter felt his entire perception of the war, the simple struggle against fascism and tanks, shatter. The war wasn't just about taking ground, it was about stopping this. Kowalski didn't need to give the order. They unslung their packs, stripped their rifles, and prepared to breach the perimeter. They knew in that silent, terrible moment that they were no longer fighting simply to win. They were fighting for the very soul of humanity.
April 11th, 1945. The barbed wire perimeter of Buchenwald concentration camp, Germany. The breakthrough across the Rhine had been swift, exhilarating, and brutal. Sergeant Ray Jenkins of the 6th Armored Division had seen everything. Tanks exploding, villages reduced to rubble, and the frantic, desperate final defense of the Third Reich. He thought he was hardened. Then his Sherman tank, the Hellcat, came to a grinding halt outside a sprawling, seemingly innocuous complex near Weimar. Unlike the small, hidden camp at Struthof, this place, Buchenwald, was massive, a city of death hidden in plain sight. The resistance was minimal. The few remaining SS guards fled the moment they heard the grinding of the Sherman's tracks. The gate, marked with the monstrously ironic German phrase "Jedem das Seine," to each his own, stood open. Jenkins climbed out of the turret, the spring air unnaturally cold. The smell, that familiar vile stench of Struthof, was 1,000 times worse here, a vast miasma of disease, waste, and burnt flesh that clung to the throat and lungs. His platoon hesitated, their rifles lowered, their eyes wide. They saw the prisoners rushing the wire, but these were not cheering, liberated people. They were ghosts. "Keep your heads up. Watch for booby traps," Jenkins barked, his voice sounding thin and weak in the open air. They moved past the outer perimeter and into the roll call square. The ground was packed earth, stained dark. The barracks stretched out in seemingly endless rows, cramped wooden cages designed for suffering. The sight of the living was worse than any dead enemy. Thousands of men, eyes darting, too weak to cheer, too traumatized to believe. They wore the stripes of the condemned, Jews, political prisoners, Roma, homosexuals, and common criminals, reduced to less than shadows of men. Jenkins walked past a block, and a small elderly man, his face a mask of yellowed skin stretched over bone, grabbed his sleeve. He spoke a torrent of French and Polish, pointing frantically toward a pile of clothes. Jenkins couldn't understand the words, but he understood the terror. Then came the buildings of administration. He entered the crematorium. It was here, in the sterile, industrial setting, that the true nature of the evil was revealed. The ovens, massive and iron, still hot from recent use. The dissecting rooms, with tables and tools of horror. The storage rooms piled high with evidence, human hair, mounds of spectacles, and gold fillings torn from the mouths of the dead. Jenkins leaned against a wall, his hand resting on the smooth, cold steel of an oven door. He had killed men on the battlefield, believing he was defending his way of life. But this was not war. This was calculated genocide, implemented with chilling bureaucratic precision. The scale was overwhelming. The memory of the smiling girl he had left back home, the moral certainty of his fight, the simple reason for pulling the trigger, all of it condensed into this one sickening, undeniable truth. He radioed his commander, his voice trembling despite himself. "We have secured the main camp, sir. Send medics, send food, and send every photographer and camera crew you have. The world has to see this. Everything we thought we were fighting for is right here."
April 29th, 1945. The gates of Dachau concentration camp, Germany. The war in Europe was mere days from its end.
for the soldiers of the 45th Infantry Division and the 42nd Infantry Division, the Rainbow Division. The final push through Bavaria was a blur of fighting and collapsing resistance. But nothing, not the shelling of Anzio, nor the bitter campaign through France, prepared them for the final gruesome revelation at Dachau. Lieutenant Carl Dixon, leading a small detachment of men, was among the first to breach the main perimeter. The air was split by a terrifying cacophony, the ragged cries of the prisoners and the sound of frantic, disorganized gunfire. The first thing they encountered was the death train. Dozens of freight cars parked on a siding near the main entrance, crammed with hundreds of dead prisoners who had been evacuated from other camps. They were skeletal, frozen in the grotesque positions of their final moments. Dixon's men, already psychologically strained by the sight, reacted instantly and violently upon finding the remains of freshly executed American prisoners within the camp. The scene led to the infamous Dachau massacre, a brief, uncontrolled explosion of retaliatory rage against the captured SS men. The discipline of the American soldier, honed by months of honorable warfare, snapped in the face of absolute evil. Later, once order was restored, the officers, realizing the gravity of what their men had just encountered, mandated that every American soldier in the vicinity tour the camp. The military command knew that no verbal briefing, no intelligence report could convey the necessary truth. The soldiers had to see it. Major General Clarence Hubner, commanding the 5th Corps, issued a directive ensuring maximum exposure. The goal was twofold: to provide irrefutable documentation for history and to psychologically solidify the meaning of the victory for the troops. Dixon led his men through the gas chambers, small, dark rooms disguised as showers with fake shower heads and sealed doors. Then through the crematorium, where the efficiency of the Nazi killing machine was laid bare in the ash pits and the stacks of logs for fuel. The smell was everywhere, clinging to their uniforms, their skin, their memories. It was in those hours, standing amidst the apparatus of mass murder, that the soldiers of the American army fully understood the moral imperative of their fight. It wasn't just about preserving freedom, it was about preventing the extinction of human values. Sergeant Arthur Peterson, a medic who had seen men die in every conceivable manner, stood outside the barracks, tears cutting clean lines through the dirt on his face. He later wrote in his journal, "We came here thinking we were fighting Hitler's army. We left knowing we were fighting a plague. And there is no price too high to pay to stamp out a plague." The sites of Dachau, Buchenwald, and the smaller, earlier camps, like Natzweiler-Struthof, transformed the Allied victory. It was no longer a mere military conquest. It became a crusade against barbarism. The liberation of the camps clarified for the world, and most profoundly for the soldiers themselves, why the war had to be won at all costs. The images they captured, the stories they recorded, became the eternal, indelible witness to the Holocaust, the ultimate realization of the horror that lay at the heart of the Third Reich.